All right, everyone get ready. Today we're going to dive deep into the life of Ott Toy. You might not know the name right away, but stick with us. Her story is incredible, especially during the California Gold Rush.
Yeah, she's like a perfect way to understand that whole time period.
Exactly. So to do this, we've got some excerpts from her Wikipedia page. And just for some background, a little info on the Gold Rush. What we're going to do is uncover how Ah Toy, who was a Chinese immigrant, became so powerful in San Francisco, ambitious, resilient, and navigating a system that was, well, not very welcoming, to say the least.
And to really get it, the context, we got to remember that before 1851, there were only 7 Chinese women documented in San Francisco.
Wow, just 7. Can you imagine? One of just a tiny handful of women in this city just exploding with people trying to get rich during the gold rush.
It's pretty amazing. And Ah Toy, I mean, she totally saw the opportunity there. She got known for these peep shows, charging a whole ounce of gold, which, was like $16 back then, just to look. I mean, think about it. $16 then was a lot of money.
Yeah, that's wild. No wonder she became one of the wealthiest women in the city. But, she was clearly thinking bigger than just peep shows.
Oh, yeah. She was a total businesswoman. She built this whole chain of brothels, even bringing women over from China to work in them. And, of course, this is where things get a little complicated, I guess. Some of these women were really young, which brings up some ethical questions. You can't just ignore that.
For sure, it really shows how much exploitation was mixed in with all the opportunities back then. And it's interesting, too, she got pushback from some of the male Chinese leaders who wanted to control that whole industry. Seems like she was shaking things up, even within her own community.
Absolutely she was. You've got to picture her navigating this world, dominated by men, constantly asserting her position. And she even used the legal system a lot to her advantage, going to court to protect her business. For example, there was this one case. She sued this guy named Yi Tai. He was trying to extort money from her, and she won, which shows how well she understood the legal system and how willing she was to stand up for her rights.
Wow, she knew the system, and she wasn't afraid to use it. But there's a big twist in this legal story, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. In 1854, there's this legal case, People v. Hall. It changed everything for her. Basically, the ruling said Chinese people couldn't testify in court, which left Ah Toy super vulnerable. She could get cheated or taken advantage of, and there wasn't much she could do legally.
So even though she was so good at using the legal system, the rules changed on her and it became almost impossible to defend herself.
Exactly. And then, to make matters worse, an anti-prostitution law passed that same year, 1854. And guess what? It was mainly enforced against Chinese women. So Ah Toy was facing discrimination on, every side.
It's hard to imagine being in that situation. I wonder what she did next.
Well, instead of giving up, she decided to leave San Francisco in 1857. And it's important to note this. She left as a wealthy woman, went back to China with the plan to live comfortably.
Yeah, it sounds like she left on her own terms. But wait, if I remember correctly, she was back in California by 1859.
That's right, she was. Which makes you think, her ties to California must have been stronger than we think. And get this, from 1868 until she died in 1928, she lived a pretty quiet life in Santa Clara County.
Quiet, but probably not uneventful, especially given how things were back then.
Right, you got it. We don't know all the details. But she had several long-term partners during those years, but she couldn't legally marry any of them if they were white because of California's anti-miscegenation laws. Just imagine that. Living in a society that wouldn't let you marry someone just because of their race.
It's really heartbreaking, and it shows all the limitations she faced, even while she was finding love and connection.
It's these kind of complex stories, interwoven with these bigger historical narratives that make Ah Toy's journey so fascinating.
I agree. These deep dives help us discover those human sides of history, the parts you don't always get in textbooks.
Yeah, I think that's what people love about these stories, that chance to connect with history on a personal level, to see the struggles and the triumphs of people who lived through these incredible times.
Speaking of connecting, Toy's story is even part of popular culture.
You're right. She's in that Cinemax series, Warrior. It takes place during the Tong Wars. In late 19th century San Francisco, there were these violent clashes between different Chinese secret societies. And the show portrays her as this really powerful figure navigating that whole world.
Oh, wow. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm definitely adding it to my list. It's so great to see these figures from history, especially someone like Ah Toy get recognized like that.
Yeah, it shows her lasting impact, even if her name isn't as well known as some others from that time.
So before we move on to the next chapter in Ah Toy's story, I gotta ask you something. What do you think she would have wanted people to remember about her if she could have told her own story, What parts of her life, her struggles, her achievements, do you think she would have focused on?
That's a really good question. It makes you think about how stories get told and whose voices get heard.
Yeah, and it shows the work that historians do to piece together these hidden stories and give a voice to people who are often ignored or marginalized.
Exactly. It reminds us that history is always changing as we uncover new perspectives and challenge the stories that have always been told.
And that's what makes it so captivating, right? There's always more to discover, more stories to uncover, more layers to peel back.
I totally agree. It's a never-ending journey of discovery. But for now, we'll leave you with that question about how Atoy would have told her own story. And we'll continue this amazing conversation in the next part of our deep dive.
It's amazing to think about how much Ah Toy accomplished. I mean, starting with so little, and then, boom, she's a major figure in San Francisco just a few years later. It really makes you think about, what drove her?
Yeah, it's tough to know for sure, but it was probably a bunch of things. I mean, you read these historical accounts, and they make her sound so smart, so resourceful, like someone who really understood how power works and used it to her advantage. But we can't forget the limitations she faced, too, right? Being a Chinese woman during that era, it wasn't exactly easy.
Right. Even with money and influence, the whole system was kind of set up to hold her back. Her story is really a powerful example of, never giving up, even when things are stacked against you. And it's not just about her own success either, right? She was a pioneer for other Chinese women, too.
Absolutely. She was one of the first to really make a mark on San Francisco's history. And that's especially amazing when you consider how few opportunities Chinese women had at that time.
Her decision to go back to China in 1857, that's so interesting to me. What do we know about why she did that? Was it like a sense of, I don't know, accomplishment, or was it something totally different?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sadly, the historical records are a bit thin on the details of why she went back. We know she was financially secure when she left, which suggests she felt like she'd reached a point where she could make that choice.
It's fascinating to imagine what that was like for her, going back to China after everything she experienced in Gold Rush San Francisco. That must have been such a huge cultural shift.
Oh, definitely. Going from that kind of wild, fast-paced world back to a more traditional society, it must have been a huge adjustment. It makes you wonder how she felt about those two worlds, right? Did she feel like she belonged in either place, or was she kind of always stuck between two cultures?
That feeling of being caught between two cultures, that's something you see in so many immigrant stories. It's a pretty universal experience no matter when or where you come from.
Totally. And it gets to the heart of questions about identity. Like, how do you define yourself when you're always moving between different worlds, expectations, and values?
That's probably something Atoy wrestled with her whole life. And then, of course, there's the fact that she came back to California just a couple years later. Why do you think she came back?
It's something historians have been trying to figure out for a long time. Some think she might have missed the energy and opportunity that California offered, even with all the discrimination. Others think maybe she had unfinished business, personal connections she couldn't leave behind.
Maybe she felt a sense of freedom in California that she didn't have in China. It's easy to forget that back then, women in a lot of parts of the world didn't have many rights or opportunities. California, even with all its problems, might have given her more personal freedom than she could find anywhere else.
That's a great point. It's possible that California, even with all its prejudice, allowed her a level of independence and self-determination that was unavailable to her elsewhere.
And you have to remember, California was still a pretty young state back then, full of potential and change. I can see how she would be drawn back to that kind of dynamic energy.
Yeah, like she was always looking for new frontiers, both geographically and personally.
It makes you wonder what she thought about all the changes happening in California during that second stay. Imagine seeing all those cities growing so fast, all those new immigrants arriving, the whole political landscape shifting.
It must have been mind-blowing to see all that happening. She was there for the gold rush, which completely transformed California from this sleepy territory to a booming state. And then she came back to see it keep changing at an incredible pace.
And through it all, she's living this seemingly quiet life in Santa Clara County, away from all the craziness, but definitely shaped by it.
Right, like she's observing everything from a distance, processing all those huge changes happening around her. She had a front row seat to some of the most important moments in California's history.
It reminds me of that saying, the quieter you become, the more you can hear. Maybe those quieter years gave her time to really think about her experiences and find her place in a world that was changing so fast.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Maybe that's why her story still speaks to us today. It reminds us that even in these big historical moments, there are always these individual journeys happening in the background, full of their own unique depth and complexity.
And sometimes it's those quiet stories, the ones whispered on the sidelines, that hold the most profound truths. It's kind of interesting how Ah Toy just stepped back from the spotlight later in life. After all those years being this like prominent figure, she chose this quiet existence.
Yeah, maybe it was her way of taking back some control,
Yeah.
defining her own story after so long of having it shaped by everyone else and what society thought she should be.
But even as she sought out that quieter life, those societal pressures, they were still there. Remember, she couldn't legally marry any of her partners if they were white because of those anti-miscegenation laws.
Yeah.
It's a harsh reminder of the racism that was just like built into American society back then.
It really makes you think. Here she was, this woman who had overcome so much, achieved financial independence, and defied expectations, but she was denied this basic right just because of her race.
It really does. It makes you think about how those laws must have affected her relationships, her sense of belonging, her ability to freely express her love. It's easy to forget those laws weren't just words on paper. They actually controlled people's lives, like dictating their choices and limiting their options.
Absolutely. Toy Story is a testament to that. She lived life on her own terms, carving out a space for herself in a world that was constantly trying to put her in a box.
A survivor, a businesswoman, a pioneer. Her
Yeah.
story reminds us that history isn't just about dates and events, it's about people. Real people navigating these complex and, let's be honest, often unjust systems.
And Toy Story reminds us that even when you're up against seemingly impossible obstacles, you can still persevere.
And even though she passed away in 1928, her legacy continues to inspire. She shows us how important it is to challenge the status quo and fight for a fairer world.
Yeah. Her story also highlights the fact that history is full of these unsung heroes. People who may not have made the headlines, but whose lives were still incredible.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into Ah Toy's fascinating life, let's take a second to appreciate her contributions, her struggles, and her triumphs. Let her story be a reminder that even when facing huge challenges, the human spirit is powerful.
And who knows, maybe somewhere out there, there's a collection of Toy's personal writings just waiting to be found. Imagine what we could learn from her firsthand account.
Until then, we'll keep putting the pieces of her story together using what we have, honoring her legacy and making sure her name is not forgotten.
And hopefully, this deep dive inspires you all to keep exploring, uncover those hidden stories that are just waiting to be told.
That's what the deep dive is all about, exploring the fascinating, often overlooked parts of history and making those stories come to life. Because after all, history is happening all around us, every single day. Go out there and make some history of your own.